Ever stood under a sky so wide your secrets felt small? Here on the Cowboy Story, we ride the stories of the West campfire, truths, trail dust, memories, saloon whispers. Gritty humans, sometimes messy. Every tale is a horizon to chase. Subscribe, pull up a stool, and maybe find a little courage for your own frontier. The hammer found the oak stake with a flat final sound. Each strike came clean through the wind, a courtroom gavel in open country. Eli McKinnon watched the surveyor in the bowler hat tug a bright line tight toward the low white teeth of the Sangre de Cristo. The cord trembled in the gusts, then steadied. One more stake, one more notch cut into his father's ground. 7 days, the surveyor said without looking up. Noon at the land office. That is what Mr. Hale told me. Eli nodded. The nod cost nothing. In his pocket lay a folded train ticket to Denver that felt like a blade. The wind slid grit along his teeth. It pulled at the brim of his hat and stung the inside of his nose with the cold scent of iron and sage. On the porch step behind him, a tin cup rang against the plank whenever the house shuddered. "You have a straight line," the surveyor added, snapping his tripod shut. "Clean boundary to the creek." Glass Creek flashed dull pewter through the cottonwoods. It ran narrow in winter, quick and tight to its stones, but its sound carried. That sound cut through his chest the way old sounds do. A horse falling, a boy's breath catching. Eli fixed his eyes on the stake instead. The surveyor climbed up onto his wagon. The wheels broke the crust of snow, leaving dark smears. He whistled something cheerful as he turned onto the track and disappeared behind a low stand of rabbit brush. The whistle died in the wind, leaving. The word kept a rhythm in Eli's head he could not stop. He saddled the roan and swung up slow. The saddle leather was stiff and loud in the cold. He took the road that curled over the ridge toward Dry Creek Junction. He told himself he did not need supplies. He went because a man rides the place he is about to abandon. He goes to look at the boards and the faces, and he tells himself why. The town sat low by the freight road, a row of false fronts trying to look taller than the valley around them. The telegraph wire sang on its poles. As Eli came in, snow squeaked under the roan's shoes. A pair of boys stopped their game and stared. A teamster lifted his chin, then set it back down when Eli's eyes touched him. The bell over Whitaker's door gave a thin, bright ring. The room smelled of coffee beans and tallow and the sharp chemical bite of bluing. Mr. Whitaker polished a glass that did not need polishing. Abigail Cole stood near the fabric bolts, the preacher's wife, pale jaw tight under a neat bonnet. Her gaze slid off Eli the way water slides off oiled leather. "Mr. McKinnon," Whitaker said, polite. "The tone men keep for a sickness they hope is not catching." "Coffee and shot," Eli said. "1 sack, 10 rounds a buck." "You do not hunt much these days," Whitaker said to the counter. "Not much." Behind him, the preacher himself appeared in the glass reflection shoulders, squared eyes soft at the edges and hard where they met. "The wind has a voice today," Reverend Cole said to the room, as if he had said it to everyone and to no one. "Some say it carries judgment." Eli's fingers tightened on the counter. The coin clanked. The bell rang again when he left. The rope on the roan's hackamore rasped under his glove, a small sound he could trust. He took the long way back along the tracks of his own fence line. The wires were up and straight steel against the sky. He crossed the saddle where the land fell toward the Collins homestead, a small square of house and a tired barn shouldering the weather. Smoke from May Collins' stovepipe went up and then flattened, pushed east. She stood out there, bareheaded, hands on her hips, looking at the back half of the barn roof that had sagged into itself like a broken rib. He put his heels to the roan to pass, and then he heard it. "McKinnon." Not a request, a summons. He eased the roan and turned his head just enough. She came across the yard with the wind in her skirt. Her hair was pulled back mean and tight, but loose strands slapped her cheek. In the cut of her coat and the set of her mouth there was no softness, only someone who had worn through to the core and found it sufficient. "You see that," she said, pointing. "I see it. It went in the night. The snow load. I have 2 horses and a milk cow on the other side. The next blow will throw the whole thing. Hard weather." "Hard weather does not take a nail out by itself," she said. "I need help." Eli looked past her at the busted ridge beam, at the way the weight had sheared the plank like a tooth. He could feel where a pry bar would fit and how the wood would answer. He did not want to know that. He had 7 days to sit in his cold house and make nothing. That knowledge felt like an ache in an old bruise. "I am packing," he said. She tipped her head. "For where?" "Denver." She studied his face, and whatever she saw did not change a thing. "I cannot pay cash," she said. "I have preserved peaches, thread coffee if you are short. I will mend. I will not ask a second time." "You do not want charity," he said. Her eyes were a winter grass color that held no light. "I want a roof." The wind went across the yard and whistled through a gap in the barn, siding with a clean three-note cry. The roan blew and shifted under him. Eli thought of a boy moving faster than a man should allow. He thought of a horse spilling blood into dust. He looked back at her and hated the small thing inside him that lifted in recognition. "First light," he said. The words came out flat and slow. "I will bring my good saw. No miracles. That is a tear down." "First light," she said. She turned and walked away without a thank you. It struck him that she had not looked at his hands once. Most people looked there first when they talked to him at the scars and the quirks of old breaks. He put the roan into a careful, sour walk and took the ridge home. The wind was higher now. The telegraph wire sang louder, then stuttered with a dry click. Near the post by the freight road, he heard the machine at the depot rattle a string of tacks that meant Cheyenne. Then the sound stopped. A slack bow formed in the wire and began to bounce one end, swinging in short, angry arcs until the break flashed bright in the pale sun. The line sagged and went quiet. He rode past his father's gate without dismounting. The yard was a hard board in the cold. The rope on the pump was frozen into the shape of a loop where someone had dropped it in weather warmer than this. In the barn, the roan stamped and blew and turned his head to look as Eli slid the blanket up to the withers. The horse's breath went up in a white column and stuck to the inside of the roof. The house door stuck on the sill. He lifted it with his shoulder and stepped in. The air held the old smell of ash and cold iron. He set the coffee on the table. The cup from the morning sat where he had left it and rattled again when the wind hit the west wall. The clock that had belonged to his mother ticked twice and stopped. He wound it, and it refused to take the wind. He went out again and stood at the edge of the porch. From here, he could see a corner of the Collins place, through a notch in the cottonwoods, a box of a house with a stovepipe that had not fallen down despite the wind and the years. Her door's iron latch shone bright where the paint had worn. The bar over it was bent into a shallow wave where something hard had struck it long ago. He knew the difference between work damage and the other kind. The gavel sound of the surveyor's hammer kept returning in his head as if the man were still here. He could almost hear the cheerful whistle. He could almost hear the horse turn on frozen ground. The wind pulled at his coat, then put it back against his body. 7 days, he thought. He could feel the shape of them inside his chest, like a series of small rooms in a line. He could walk each one and find nothing in it but a stove that would not take and a bed that did not warm. He looked at his hands and saw powder ground into the lines and a raw edge along the nail of the thumb where he had ripped it up to the quick last week lifting a post out of frost. He went inside and took down the saw with the straight kerf and the handle oiled to a dark shine by his father's palm and his own. He set it in the corner by the door where he would not forget it in the morning. He put an extra handful of nails in a muslin sack and tied it off with a piece of baling twine. He sat on the edge of the bunk and took the ticket to Denver out of his pocket and set it on his knee and then put it back. The wind made the houseboards click and breathe. Somewhere a mouse worked at something that sounded like paper. Eli took off his boots and set them side by side with the heels kissing. He lay down on the blanket with his coat still on and closed his eyes. He did not dream of Owen. He never dreamt of Owen. He dreamt of the creek. It ran with a sound like chain on stone, and each bend was a place where you could hide a man with a rifle if you had a mind to do it. He woke with the taste of river water in his mouth, and the sound of the telegraph he had heard breaking turned into the steady hush of the wind. Out on the porch again, the morning colder, he watched the eastern ridge pale as if he had not slept at all. The line still hung dead over the depot. The cut end flashed when light came through a gap in the cloud, a quick wink, and then nothing. Whatever news was coming would ride a horse through the snow to bring it. He took the saw and the sack of nails and the coil of rope and put them by the roan. The horse lifted his head and blew and put it back down to the hay. Eli checked the cinch by habit. He looked once toward the notch in the trees. Nothing moved. The door of May Collins' place stayed shut. The bent bar caught a piece of weak light and returned it to him in a thin line. He cinched the saddle, swung up, and turned the roan's nose to the south trail. The wind came across the flats with a clean edge. The only sound besides the wind was the ring of the horse's shoes. The cold pressed in on the skin under his coat. He could taste iron again. He rode toward the broken roof and the woman who had not said thank you. The telegraph line behind him hung quiet. By first light the cold cut clean and the sky was the color of tin. Eli set the muslin sack of nails beside the roan's shoulder, looped the coil of rope over the horn, and tied the saw across the cantle. Frost bit the leather. His hands felt thick inside the gloves. He breathed into them and climbed up. The Collins place came up out of the pail like a block set on a white table. Smoke rose from the stovepipe in a straight column that flattened once it found the higher air. May stood in the yard as if she had not moved since he had left her, the wind tugging stray hair loose. She wore a coat too thin for this kind of morning, and a canvas apron spotted with pitch. "You are late," she said. The ridge was slick. The ridge is always slick. He slid from the saddle, dropped the rope, and stood for a second to feel the yard under his boots. It was hard and empty and louder than it looked. The wind ran a thin note through the gaps in the barn siding. He handed her the sack of nails. She did not take it. He set it on the plank by the door and touched the sag in the roofline with his eyes. "The ridge beam is split. The braces on that side are gone," he said. "You tell me something I do not see, and I will thank you." They went to work. Eli knocked a path through the drift from the yard to the barn with the flat of the shovel. The shovel rang against buried rock, and his arm took the shock up to the shoulder. Inside, the air smelled of old hay, warm animal breath, and damp wood. The standing half of the roof held a light so weak it was more like a memory. A mare blew and turned to look at them from her stall, ears flicking. The cow shifted and let out a soft, angry sound that steamed in the cold. "Pull every board you can save," Eli said. "Work with the nail. Do not fight it." He showed her with the claw of the hammer and the heel of his hand easing the iron through along the grain. The board cried, then gave. May watched once and then did it, wrists straight, jaw set. When a nail broke, she slid the pry bar under it, took the head with the nippers, and pulled. The wood came away whole. Her breath fogged and hung near her face. At midday, the light was already thinning. She went inside and came back with 2 tin cups and a heel of bread with a spread of something sweet and pale. Steam drifted up from the coffee. Eli wrapped his hands around the cup and held it near his mouth before drinking. The heat moved down into him like something alive, and he felt it pool under his ribs. They ate standing by the pile of boards they had salvaged. The wind sang the same 3 notes through the siding over and over like a stubborn bird. Tired lifted into Eli like a tide. He sipped again and pointed with the cup. "You brace from the main wall. A lean roof. Ugly as fine. Strong as needed." "Ugly suits me," she said. He hit wrong later, swinging from the frame, thumb meeting steel. Sharp light blew across his vision. He hissed, and the hammer clattered and fell. Heat flooded his face in a quick, useless anger. "This is nothing," he said, too loud. "You fix a corner and the wind tears the other side. You nail one seam and the snow finds the next seam. This land takes. That is all it understands." She did not look up from the plank she was cutting. "The land is not a person," she said. "It does not understand. It does not owe. It is. We are the ones who make it a promise and then shake a fist when it keeps quiet." He stood there, holding his throbbing hand, the words falling between them and bending the air, and then he shook himself and climbed back up and set the crosspiece. The work took the bite out of the anger. The work always did when he gave over to it. He set his eye along the plank and nodded and drove the 10-penny nails in and felt the head seat. The sound was good. By late afternoon they had a roof line on the standing half that did not lean. It was not handsome. Half the boards had the gray sheen of old weather, and the other half flashed a pale saw color. The beam braced clean against the main wall and held. They stood a moment in the yard, both of them out of breath. He felt his own ribs with the breath and thought about how many days a man could spend beating himself dull against a piece of earth, and how little that mattered once a roof stopped blowing. "You will stay for stew," she said from the door. He almost said no. The thought of his house with no fire in it made his throat close. He nodded and followed her inside, feeling the heat wrap him just under the skin as the door shut. It was one room, clean. The stove ticked and a pot let out a low bubble. She ladled and set a bowl in front of him and another for herself. Bread again. No talk for a while. Spoons touched tin and the stove sang, and the wind worked the edge of the door in a way that was almost like a hand. He washed his hands in cold water from a basin and dried them on a cloth that had been mended so many times it had become mostly mending. When he stood, the room leaned a little in his eyes from the tired and the heat. He reached for his coat. "I will check the bracing," he said, and heard it for what it was as he said it. He went to the barn and climbed the ladder into the loft. The loft held the smell of old summers and dust and the green ghost of hay. The new boards still gave off a pale, sap-raw scent that cut through the rest. Moonlight came through the seams in long bars. He walked the length and put a shoulder into the brace, solid. The ladder creaked. He turned. May came up slow, one hand on each rung. Her hair, freed, now fell to her shoulders. The coat was still on. She stopped with her boots on the top rung and then stepped onto the boards. They stood not quite facing each other. Breath moved between them in white shapes. Down below the mare shifted, and the rope at her halter knocked the stall board twice. "Thank you," she said, and her voice had changed. He could not think of a good answer, and so he gave none. She came 2 steps closer. In the thin light he saw that her mouth was rough with cold and work. He heard the same 3 notes of wind in the siding and felt them in the hollow of his chest. Her hand found his coat front and pressed. He felt the shape of her fingers through the wool. Then she rose on her toes and put her mouth on his. It was not careful. It was not sweet. Heat ran through his back and his neck and into his jaw. He tasted coffee and salt and sawdust. His hands came up, but not to pull her in. He caught her arms and held them because he did not know what else to hold. He drew back an inch breath hard, and she did not move. Her eyes were open and steady. "I am leaving," he said. His voice came out as if it had been unused for months. "I know. 6 days. She nodded. She stood there like a stake he could not pry up. He let her arms go. He stepped back until his shoulders touched a post, and then he moved past her and found the ladder without taking his eyes from her face. He felt his boot on nothing and caught the rung and went down fast and crossed the barn, and then he was outside with the cold sliding a clean line up under his coat. He put his foot in the stirrup and was on the roan and into the dark where the hills eat sound. He did not point the roan at his house. He let the horse find open ground, and he let the cold strip him of the heat of her mouth. The next morning he came as he had said he would. He said nothing about the loft, and she said nothing. They worked until the knuckles of his right hand split under the cold and bled into his glove. Words were only tools between them. "Hold here. That board is rot." Pass the saw. They ate at the threshold, backs to opposite jambs, 2 cups between them, steam twisting up and disappearing. By the 3rd day the roof held, and the walls did not flex. He left the extra nails under a stone by the door, and she did not say thank you, and he did not mind the absence of the word. That night the wind rose early and did not let up. Eli could hear it get its teeth into the siding of his father's house and pull. He put a little whiskey in his coffee and sat by a cold stove that refused to take. He told himself out loud once that his work would hold, and then he stopped talking because the empty room made any voice sound foolish. The telegraph line was still dead. The sound that had been like a machine became only wind again. He went to the barn with the lantern to check the roan. The light made a blunt yellow circle in the cold. The horse turned his head and put his nose in Eli's coat and breathed hot against the cloth, then went back to his hay. Eli heard the storm work the roof on the far side of the barn, where the walls had always been suspect. He set the lantern on a nail and stood with his hands in his pockets a long time. He did not make a plan to go. He simply found himself out in the yard with his collar up and his head down, moving along the fence he knew as if he were counting it. The wind walked him. Sleet cut his ears. The lantern light from his barn fell away behind, and he saw another light far off, thin and weak and moving in a stagger near the line of the Collins place. He stopped, then began to run. The ground had a skin of ice on it that shattered under his boots and then grew back in the next step. He caught a stump with his foot and went to a knee and got up and kept moving. The light in the Collins yard flared and went out and then came back. He smelled a harsh sweetness that he knew, and it took him a second to name it. The smell was canvas, wet with cold and smoke where smoke should not be. He came through the gate, and the lower yard showed itself all at once in the flare of his lantern. The barn door stood open. The wind took the opening and made it into a throat. Snow moved through the air sideways. Inside a ladder leaned long against the bad wall. May stood on the 4th rung with a hammer and a piece of canvas that snapped in her hands like a flag. Her coat was soaked until it shone, and her hair stuck to her neck. She drove a nail with a flat, hard motion, and the canvas blew back and hit her in the face. She swore and said it again. "What are you doing?" he shouted, and the wind took half the words. She started, and the ladder swung 2 inches and came back. "Saving my barn," she shouted and hit the nail. A board somewhere let go with a sound like a big animal tearing. The wind found the gap, and the 3 notes became a long scream. Eli felt the pull in the floorboards. He dropped the lantern on a ledge and went to the ladder. "Get down." "I'm fine." The ladder jumped again. He put one hand on the side and felt the wood flex under the cold and the weight. He could see the old plank that had lifted along one edge and was letting the storm into the bones of the wall. The canvas would not hold without the board. He reached up and caught the back of her coat near the waist. "Get down," he said. She swung the hammer one more time. The nail bent and the head skittered down and vanished into the hay. The ladder slid a hand's breadth and caught. He pulled her off the rung and felt her body go weightless for a second. The ladder kicked and slammed back to the wall. The blown canvas struck both their faces and rapped them in a cold slap. They hit the floor with their boots, and the hammer went under the stall board with a rattle. The bad board lifted another inch with a rapid stutter of sounds. The wind came through in a clear white sheet and drove snow into the stalls. The mare screamed and struck the side with a hoof. May shoved Eli away and turned to go back up the ladder without looking at him. He caught her wrist. She pulled angry and jerked free and grabbed the ladder with both hands. The whole wall gave a little and came back. The lantern flame on the ledge leaned flat and then stood up. Eli looked at the split board. He looked at the canvas, and at her hands blue, where the skin showed, and at the animals blowing panic into the cold. He set his jaw and went for the loose plank as the storm took another bite. The plank had lifted along the grain and was working loose under each gust. Eli slid his fingers under the edge and felt the bite of old splinters. The board jumped in his hands as if it wanted out. He pressed until the heel of his hand took the load and then drove the nail home with the flat of the hammer he pulled from the hay. The iron sank crooked. He pulled reset and hit again. The wall settled by a finger's width and held. Snow still drove through the seams. Eli shouldered into the gap and set his back to the storm while he worked. Sleet stung the skin above his collar. He could taste iron and pine. The wind shoved and he shoved back, and the barn stopped breathing like a thing in panic and began to fold into a hard, cold steadiness. By the time he found the second loose board, his fingers were wooden inside the gloves. He worked them open and closed until the feeling came back in a rush that made him sick. He shoved the plank into place and drove 2 more nails and reached for a third, and then stopped because the sound in the barn had changed. The scream had broken into a dull, steady push, and the animals had calmed enough to chew. He stood there with the hammer in his fist, and time came back into the room. May was gone. The ladder leaned with a tired tilt. The lantern guttered and nearly went out in one long pull of wind, then straightened. A minute later, she came back to the opening shoulders, hunched against the weather, carrying a steaming tin pot, a tin cup, and a folded wool blanket dark with old grease. She set the pot on a bale and poured. The coffee scalded and ran heat down his throat and into the shaken part of him. She handed him a heel of bread wrapped around a slab of cold bacon. He ate without tasting it and felt something in his chest unclench with the food and the heat. "You are a fool," he said when he could talk. His voice came out hoarse and somewhere close to gentle. "You would have gone head first if that ladder let go." "I am a survivor," she said. "You are a woman alone in a storm nailing canvas to rot." Her face hardened like ice. For a second she looked past him the way a person looks to put a thought far away. Then she turned back. "And what are you?" she said. "You sit in a house with no fire and pretend the wind is a judge. You run from something that rides your shadow anyway." It hit him clean and hard with no place to hide. He set the cup down on the bale because his hand had begun to shake. She saw it and did not speak. She pulled the blanket up around his shoulders. The wool held the smell of smoke and soap. He could feel the line where her hand had warmed it in the carry. They sat on the bale with the tools between their boots, the way a truce sits between people who have not decided what to do next. The mare chewed. The lantern made a soft noise when a moth found the heat and then gave up the reach. Morning came thin and raw, then moved into a day that could not decide what to be. The wind kept its edge. They worked until the light failed. The roof did not take lift. The patched wall took the shove and gave only the inch it needed. He left by the side path and did not look back into the loft as he passed. They rode into town the following day because the oil in her lamp had gone to a thumb's depth and because nails run out without asking. The roan pushed frost up with every step. The telegraph wire still hung slack and dead above the depot, a loose length that clacked in the gusts and then fell quiet. Dry Creek looked at them the way a dog looks at a hand it expects to strike. The preacher and his wife stood at the church steps with their heads close. Mr. Whitaker shifted behind his counter as if he were working a sum in his head that kept coming out wrong. Men moved aside without looking as Eli shouldered for the door. May came through after him, chin-up, coat tight. They bought kerosene, a box of matches, and a sack of flour. Not much else. Whitaker rapped slow and precise. The bell rang when they stepped out. Abigail Cole stood with another woman under the awning. Her mouth moved without sound and then found words when they thought no one was near enough to hear. The word sin hung on the air like a cold breath. Eli's hand fell toward his belt and then stopped there, not on the pistol, just near it. He felt the pull to look at the preacher and to the church, but something in the set of May's shoulders held his eyes. She turned to him and took the lapels of his coat and pulled him down and kissed him. Not hidden, not apologetic. The kiss carried heat and taste and a thin trace of iron still in his mouth from the night before. Around them the street went uncannily quiet, as if the wind had dropped and left the valley without a voice. The team hitched to a freight wagon snorted once and stamped. Someone's boot scuffed the plank. May stepped back and looked him steady in the face. She did not glance left or right. She picked up the kerosene and the matches and walked to her horse. He stood for a half-second with the cold on his lips, and then he smiled without meaning to. It was like catching a glimpse of an old friend in a glass and realizing the friend was yourself. That night he went to her place not for work and not for stew. He went because the quiet in his house felt like wire pulled too tight. The sky was thin and the stars had that brittle light they have when the cold is past thinking. He found her in the barn, with the animals settled, and the floor swept clean as if sweeping could contain a storm. They climbed to the loft and sat against a beam. The world outside could get what it wanted. In the seam of light his eyes picked out a line that ran across her shoulder and another that crossed it lower and faded into her dress. She sat very still for a long time. Then she reached for the buttons and worked them with the care of someone removing nettles. She turned and slid the cloth from her shoulder. The skin was pale where sun had never been and marked with lines that did not belong on any person. He put his hand out and did not touch it first. His fingers hovered and then found her skin. He followed one white line with 2 fingers and felt her shiver, not with cold, with the terrible memory in the nerves. He leaned and put his mouth there, heat to scar, not to claim anything, just to tell the skin it was seen. She let a sound out that did not have a name. He rested his forehead against her back and drew a breath as if he were the one surfacing. They made a bed from the old quilts and the smell of hay and the clean bite of the night. It was slow. It was full of pain that had nowhere else to live and had finally been given a place to stand where it could be looked at without breaking the looker. The fire came 2 nights later. It moved across the southern pasture like a wall that had changed its mind about staying put. The light threw a false dawn at the barn doors. May ran with a wet blanket and a bucket. Eli heard the rumble from his yard and saw the sky cut orange and then knew. He did not saddle. He took the roan bareback and let the horse run until the breath came ragged from both of them. May beat at the edge of the fire and it gave nothing. He grabbed her by the shoulders and turned her toward the stalls. "Animals," he shouted. She went without argument. He saw riders on the ridge, cut in black against the fire, 2 of them. The laugh rode the wind and reached him thin and cruel. He threw himself at the nearest when their horses turned to wheel. The man was Pike Turner Hale's hired hand with a scar under his eye. Eli took him by the collar and the belt and tore him from the saddle. The man hit hard and rolled and got a hand toward his gun. Eli was on him before it cleared. The fist found bone. The next found flesh. The next found a flat space that gave, and he felt it through his knuckles like a sound. The world narrowed into the red ring that comes just before the dark. He could hear his own breath louder than anything louder than the fire. The man's hands fluttered at his forearms and then dropped. Eli raised his fist again. May was there suddenly. Her hands hit his shoulders, and she pulled with everything she had. He did not turn. He threw his arm out, and his hand met her, and she went down in the snow. The sight of her there, coat white with sleet mouth open to pull in air, took the world back to its full size. He looked down at the man under him. Pike's face had gone from angry to frightened, to that loose animal blankness a face takes when it has been hit too many times. Blood ran into his ear and pooled there. Eli rocked back onto his heels with his hands up in front of him as if they were something he had picked up by mistake. He got to his feet, and the fire threw shadow across him that made his size look wrong. He ran. He got on the roan, and he went out across the frozen ground until the fire was just a light behind a hill, and then it was nothing. He put one hand to his mouth and found that his lip was bleeding, and he had not felt it happen. When he came back, it was the 3rd day. The pasture was a black skin stretched tight over dead grass. The barn stood. The patched wall had held. The smell of smoke had gone into the wood and would not leave. Pike Turner was gone, dragged away by his friend in the night. Sheriff Tom Evers rode in after noon with 2 deputies and a face that had not slept. Victor Hale came with them in a new coat. There was a paper in the sheriff's hand. He read it like a man who hoped the words would change while he spoke them. "May Collins," he said, "I have a warrant to search this property for cattle and tack reported missing by Mr. Hale." May stood in her doorway with a dishcloth in her hand. She did not move. Eli stood in the yard with smoke in his clothes and scab on his knuckles. "Lies," Eli said. Hale smiled as if at a child who had miscounted. "My men saw her running strays through her fence at night. Judge Tulliver takes theft as a serious matter. You know his stand on character." Evers shifted in his saddle. He looked at Eli, and then could not hold the look. He lifted a hand to the deputies. They fanned out without interest, as if they were walking through a pasture to check posts. The search turned up nothing worth a second look. Evers read the floor with his eyes not her, and then folded the paper and put it away. "Charges are filed," he said, and his voice had gone small. "Hearing set for Monday." Hale touched the brim of his hat toward May without actually touching it. "There are remedies, of course," he said. "A man could come to terms and find that friends become generous." He left with his men, and the yard fell back into its old shape. The fire smell still lived there like a person who would not leave a room when asked. Eli stood with his hat in his hand. He felt the pull of something in him that wanted to break every window in Hale's big house. He felt the other pull that said he could do more damage with a word given to the right ear in the right office if he could find such an ear. He looked at May. She had not put the dishcloth down. Her fingers had twisted it until the cloth was a rope. "Marry me," he said. The words were flat and came out without ornament. "Today, in the next county, my name can stand between you and that paper. A wife does not testify. A husband speaks and is heard." She blinked once as if he had thrown light at her. She took a slow breath, and then she shook her head. "I will not trade one cage for another," she said, "not even a cage built by a kind hand. This is not a cage. This is law." "It sits the same," she said. "A man's name around my life. I have worn that ring, Eli. It leaves a mark even after it is gone." He stepped closer. He did not reach for her. He wanted to. He kept his hands at his sides. "They will take you," he said. "You know what a cell is." She lifted her chin. The dishcloth went still in her hands. "I will not be owned," she said. He swallowed, and the hurt he felt had a taste like something metal. He nodded once, then again. He set his hat on his head and walked to the roan. "You win," he said. He bridled without saddling. He slid up, and the horse took his weight and turned his head as if to ask where. Eli put his heels in, and the roan found the south road. He did not look back. The fence line took him out of the yard, and the yard became a small square and then a mark on the land and then nothing. May sat on the new step he had set in place with his father's saw. The wood still held a faint smell of green. She put the dishcloth down on her knee and stared at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. The wind kept its 3 notes, but they sounded different, like the same song played on a smaller, lonelier instrument. The telegraph wire above the depot stayed slack and quiet. The cold pushed in and took the room that had warmed when he walked through it and set it back to the mean little place it had been before. She went inside and closed the door and set the bar. It slid into the socket with a gritty sound and held. He did not sleep more than a handful of minutes at a time on the road. The roan ran out of give near the relay shack at Elk Ridge, and he traded for a black with a bony croup and a fast mind. He shoved coin at a man with hay in his beard and took a strip of jerky in his teeth while he tightened the cinch. Snow came in brief, tight storms and then left the air so clear it felt like drinking glass. Denver rose out of the flats as smoke and angles. Streets clattered with iron. Eli slid from the saddle like an old hinge and led the black to a hitch and stood a second to find where his legs had gone. The sign over the door read, "United States Land Office." The brass had lost its shine. Inside, a stove ticked and gave off little heat. The room smelled of damp wool and old paper. A clerk with narrow shoulders looked up from a pile of forms. He had a nose that hooked down and a smooth patch where a ring would have worn a circle on his finger if he had ever worn one. "Help you," the man said, and the way he said it made it sound like a question that expected no answer. "I need maps," Eli said. "Water surveys, San Luis Valley, Glass Creek, and the headwaters up near the ridge that falls to the south." "We keep county filings at the county," the clerk said. He reached for a new form. "You will want the courthouse at Alamosa. I will want the federal maps," Eli said. "The ones that show surveyed streams and the parcels that were never taken into patent." He put his hands on the edge of the counter and leaned in. His knuckles were scabbed from where he had slipped and caught himself on stone. Old maps. The clerk looked at his hands, then at his face. He set the form aside. He took a key from a ring and walked to a tall case with small drawers and clean brass numbers. He pulled 2 drawers and then a third and brought back a folded set of papers that smelled like basements and mold and a little like mice. He spread them on the counter and weighted the corners with a staple and a glass paperweight that held a fly that had given up long ago. Eli leaned over the map. Rivers were drawn with a fine blue line. Property lines sat on the paper like a fence lay on hills, never where the land wanted them. He traced with a finger until he found Glass Creek. He followed it past his gate and around the long knuckle of land where the cottonwoods kept their feet wet. He kept following until the blue line curled itself tight against the stones at the very head, and there the script named it Quartz Spring. The line above it that would have marked a patent line did not exist. The space above the spring was white on the map and full of numbers that meant survey but not claim. Eli looked up. The clerk was watching his face and not the map. "That is unassigned," the clerk said. "We never got a man in to prove it up. Too rocky, they say. If a homesteader holds farm right at the lower ground and no man ever filed for water at the source," Eli said, "then a claim can be set in the homesteader's name." The clerk made a small sound in his throat. "If the forms are correct and the fee is paid," he said, "and if there is no prior appropriation from another claimant, which there is not." He paused. "You are not the homesteader." Eli reached for his pocket and brought out his father's folder with the original deeds where the ink had faded to a brown that looked like tea. He set it with care on the counter and turned it around so the man could read the name. McKinnon. He set another paper on the pile, a letter from a lawyer in Pueblo that had dust on it. He set a coin on the map and kept his hand on it and felt the cold through the callus. "The claim goes to May Collins," he said. He said her name with a steadiness that surprised him. "File it clean. From Quartz Spring to the McKinnon Gate. Full flow. Senior right. Every seal you have." The clerk looked at the coin and then at Eli's eyes and made a decision you could see settle in his shoulders. He swept the maps aside, brought out a form that had blue ink at the top that still held a shine and a stamp box and a pen with a flex nib. The pen scratched and sang while he wrote. He asked 3 questions. Eli answered each in a sentence with no waste. They stood at the counter as if it were an altar. The clerk dusted the wet ink with sand and blew the sand off, and the grains fell into the box like small stones. He pressed the first seal and then the second and the third. The paper took the weight of the embosser and held the new shape without complaint. "Sign here, as witness," the clerk said. Eli put his name down in the stiff, careful hand his mother had taught him at the table with a slate and crumbs of chalk. He paid the fee and laid another coin on the counter and did not pick it back up. The clerk slid the stamped patent into an oilskin and wrapped it with a string that had been cut from a longer string and still had a curl to it. He pushed it toward Eli. "For May Collins," the clerk said. "For May Collins," Eli said. He rode out before the light could fail. The black carried him as far as the last relay where he traded for the roan, and both of them went the rest of the distance as if something behind were trying to catch their heels. He slept once sitting in the saddle and woke to find the roan standing with his head down under a cottonwood that had grown against its own roots and thrown its branches at a funny angle to get the light. He reached the Collins place in the gray before dawn. He almost fell when he swung down. He caught the rail of the porch and stood with his head down until the ground steadied. He knocked with his knuckles because his hand could not make a fist. The door opened and the heat of the small room hit his face. May stood there with her hair pulled back and her eyes set the way they set when she did not know what thing was about to ask something of her. "I could not let him take your life and call it law," he said. His voice had gone to a raw place. "I found the spring." He opened the oil skin. The smell of the paper and the clerk's sand came into the room. He held out the folded patent. She took it with both hands. She read. Her lips moved once. The string fell to the floor. "My name," she said, and her voice was soft in a way he had not heard from her. "It is my name." He sat because there was nowhere else for him to go. She set the paper on the table as if it were a sleeping child. She made coffee and set the cup in his hand, and this time he drank without waiting for the heat to move. It burned his throat and brought tears to his eyes, and he did not mind the sting. The next morning Victor Hale rode in with Sheriff Evers and 2 deputies. Pike Turner was not with them. The men came at a walk and did not hurry the horses. The sky hung low, and the cold sat in the hollows like a living thing. Evers swung down with a face that had learned to show nothing. He had a paper again, and he looked like he did not want to read it. Hale stayed in the saddle and turned the horse to look east and then west, as if he were bored with the shape of the yard. "Mrs. Collins," Evers said. He touched the brim of his hat. "There is a warrant to search this property for stolen cattle and tack belonging to Mr. Hale." May did not look at Eli. She walked past both men and held out the patent with the 3 raised seals. The light caught the embossing and made it shine pale. "This is a federal patent," she said. "Quartz Spring to the McKinnon Gate. Senior right to all waters of Glass Creek. Filed and sealed in Denver. My name." Evers took the paper and then read again with his lips moving. He went a little gray in the cheeks and handed the paper back to her with care as if it would bruise. He cleared his throat. "Frank," he said, without looking at Hale, "I cannot execute this warrant now. This is above me." Hale reached a hand as if to take the paper. May did not give it. He let his hand fall. He smiled, but it looked like something had pulled the skin wrong. He turned the horse toward Eli. "You think a stamp changes the world," Hale said. "You have no idea how many stamps I own." Eli stood with the porch post at his shoulder and the cold steady in his chest. He did not put his hand to the gun. He let silence do the work it could do. "Get off this land," Eli said after a time. "You are trespassing." Evers put his boot back in the stirrup like a man whose leg had gone to sleep, and he did not want anyone to notice. He mounted and turned his horse. The deputies did the same. Hale sat a moment longer. The horse under him snorted and stamped, and the breath hung in a cloud. He looked at May and then past her into the small house and then back at Eli. "This is not finished," he said. He took the road at a trot. The men went with him. The yard took its shape again slowly, like mud finding level after a boot is pulled out. May stood very still. The patent hung at her side, her fingers white where they gripped the edge. Eli stepped onto the porch and reached for her hand, and she let him take it. He ran his thumb along the line where the paper had creased. Her hand trembled once, and then held steady. That night the loft felt like the only room in the valley. The cold held outside, and the candles made islands of soft light along the beam. They sat close and did not talk. She stood and undid the first 2 buttons of her nightdress, and then paused as if listening for something inside herself. She came to him, and knelt and looked up and spoke with a voice he had not heard, because it had not existed yet. "You did not put your name on me," she said. "You put mine back where it goes." He lifted his hand and traced the curve of her cheek with a knuckle that still held a bruise. He pulled her to him, and the kiss did not carry hunger or defiance. It carried rest. He felt the slow turn in his chest, like a clock being set to the correct hour. He reached into his pocket and brought out the watch. He pressed the crown between finger and thumb. It clicked. He held it close to his ear and waited, and the sound came at last. The tiny tick like a small heart that had gone quiet and then found a reason to move. Outside, snow fell in a steady veil that made the pasture into a single blank page. The fence posts were half gone under white. The burnt edge of the south field had been softened so that a man would have to look to see what had happened there. The creek ran under its skin of ice with a sound like a whispered word that does not need to be heard by anyone else. They lay under the old quilts, and the loft held them, and the new wood held the roof, and the wind sang through the siding in 3 notes that did not sound like a warning any longer. The horses below shifted once and started to sleep their weight, a comfort in the dark. The house on the ridge, cold and empty, might as well have been a ruin on a far hill. Here, where the air smelled of hay and pine pitch and a little of coffee, May's name lay in the middle of the table in the room below, heavy and true. The watch ticked. The snow fell. The night stayed simple and whole. Winter came as if someone had shut a door on the valley. The sky lowered and stayed there. Snow did not fall so much as gather from every direction until fences went under and the world turned into the shape of the wind. Eli moved his bedroll and a crate of tools into May's cabin. The room tightened around the 2 of them and somehow grew warmer. Heat from the small stove reached the corners now. Mornings began with the soft clink of the kettle and the smell of coffee steam clouding the window and leaving a crescent of warmth on the glass where a finger could draw a line. They made paths. First from the door to the barn, then a narrow road across the drifted yard to the woodpile. Eli hitched the roan to a crude sledge and dragged hay from his empty barn down to May's stalls. The runners hissed over ice. Frost bloomed in his beard. When the wind cut hard, they spoke in signs and short words and let the rhythm of the work carry the rest. In the afternoons when light thinned to pewter, he fixed things that had no business staying broken. The porch step had a treacherous tilt. He tore it out and set new stringers, then planed a salvaged plank until the grain showed clean and silver. The door stuck in cold weather. He pulled the hinges, shaved the jamb, seated the screws until the latch caught smooth. He oiled the iron and watched the bar fall into place with a sound that did not scrape anymore. "Try it," he said. May lifted the latch. The door opened with a quiet sigh. She closed it and opened it again, testing the swing, then looked over her shoulder at him and nodded once. No more words needed. He built a chair. The old roof boards gave up enough sound pieces to shape rockers and an arm. He cut by eye, sanded until the rough turned to satin, pinned the joints with pegs, and rubbed oil into the wood until the color deepened. He set it by the stove and stepped back. She came in with flour on her hands, stopped and touched the curve. She sat. The chair took her weight and found its whispering rhythm on the floorboards. She did not cry. Her eyes shone in a way that made him look away. The thaw that was not a thaw came for half a day. The top inch of ground gave under a boot and then stiffened again. May carried a burlap bundle to the strip of dirt under the window and knelt. The cold crawled up through her skirt. Eli walked over and stood above her with his hands in his coat. "Too cold to plant." "They are not for now," she said. "Lupine, Jamie liked them." He watched her set the roots careful, as if she were laying an old story to rest. She pulled straw over the spot and tied it down with twine. Her breath went quick from the crouch and came back slow when she stood. The sheriff rode out with the mail that week. His scarf had ice in it. He took off his hat at the door and did not track snow in. He handed May the letters and a folded sheet from the county that did not matter anymore. His eyes found the patent on the shelf and went thoughtful. "You two need anything before the next blow," he said. "We are all right," May said. He touched his brim and left, and the look he gave Eli on the way down the steps had more in it than the careful blank he used in town. At supper one night, Ruth Harper and Etta Sloan came with their children and a ham bone wrapped in cloth. May had stew on and cornbread that came from a skillet black as a moonless sky. They ate with their gloves drying near the stove, and the children asleep on a quilt by the chair before the bowls were clean. Talk stayed near the ground, the price of seed, the long walk to the pump, the way frost gets into the nails on a night like this. After they left, Eli stacked bowls in the washpan and set water to warm. He did not say he would ride to town for anyone. He did not need to. May's hand brushed his sleeve when she passed behind him with a dish, and the touch said enough. 2 days later, a wagon with tired wheels camped on the edge of Dry Creek. A black family stood near the small fire, making a thin soup, the children wrapped in blankets that did not quite cover their legs. The saloon had turned them away. Whitaker would not write credit. Eli led his roan down the road and stood by the fire and warmed his hands without asking anything until names arrived from the cold. The father was Zeke Carter. His palms had the cross-hatched lines of a man who had cut wood in a place that grew trees. Eli walked with him along the frozen creek until the water spoke through ice and the long bend on lower glass showed itself. Cottonwoods grew there thick enough to break wind. The snow gathered smooth and deep in the lee. He told Zeke what the land did in spring and where the fence could run to give the smallest trouble. In town, he stood in the land office and signed a strip to Zeke for $1. The clerk's eyes jumped between their faces and the paper, and then he stamped it because a stamp was the work in front of him. The town swelled with a kind of low noise that has no shape. At Whitaker's, a rancher with a red neck and a hat too clean spoke too loud about Eli, as if Eli were not standing 3 feet away. First he lies with the Collins widow. Now he gives land to strangers. Next he will hand the valley to whoever asks. He said Jed's name wrong on purpose. May set her flour on the counter with care. She turned. The store found its own quiet. "Mr. Peterson," she said. Her voice did not rise. "Mr. McKinnon has more respect in his left hand than you brought into this room in your whole life. He respects the law. He respects winter. He respects a family who wants ground under them. You do not speak his brother's name here, not in this store, not under this roof." Peterson flushed and found his hat brim with fingers that would not settle. He looked to Whitaker and found no help there. He looked down at his boots. No disrespect meant he mumbled. "Good," May said. Mr. Whitaker put Mr. Carter's supplies on Mr. McKinnon's account. The one his pelt set last month. Whitaker nodded. The pencil scratched. The women near the cloth bolts pretended to study calico and could not keep their mouths from a small line of surprise. The bell rang when the door opened and the noise of the street came in, and then cut again. Eli stacked wood behind the church on a day when the cold gave up trying to be clever and simply settled its full weight into every nail and bone. He split rounds while Reverend Cole carried kindling with his collar turned up. They did not talk for a while. "Thank you," the preacher said at last. The words came out like something he had found at the bottom of a drawer and had decided still worked. Eli nodded and set another round and let the axe do the clean work it could do when it met a straight grain. A letter from St. Louis came in a hand that had not forgotten a brother. Eli turned it over 3 times before opening it. He read with his finger under the words like he had when he was small. He sat in the chair he had built and read out loud to May about two boys who had lost a front tooth and a small girl who had learned to say the word horse without fear. Near the end, the letter asked if a visit would be welcome once the passes opened and the snows went back to the high places. May put her hand over his on the paper. "Say yes," she said. He looked at the patent on the shelf and at her hand on his, and at the window where a small circle of glass had cleared from the heat of the stove. The rest of the pane was white with breath and winter. He said nothing for a time, then folded the letter and set it beside the clock. The telegraph clicked again one afternoon while he walked back from the barn with the lantern. Someone had climbed the pole and stitched the wire back together. The sound came across the flats like a cautious voice that had decided to speak. It did not carry news that mattered to them, but it sounded like the world finding its joints after a long sit. He went outside after the sun dropped behind the ridge and stood with his hat off. Snow began to fall with a fine grain, almost like fog you could feel. The fence posts wore round caps. The roan blew and pushed his nose into Eli's shoulder and stood there for a while, as if the two of them were waiting for the same thing, and neither knew what to call it. That night they took quilts up to the loft and set candle stubs along the beam until small islands of light sat in the dark. They ate bread and cheese and drank coffee sweetened with a little molasses. The horses stamped once below and then settled. The new roof did not creak. The walls answered the wind with the same 3 notes, but softer now, almost tender. May lay with her head on his chest and listened. He could feel the slow work of her breath in the place under his ribs where the day had set down its weight. He lifted his hand and found her hair in the dark and let his fingers rest. On the shelf below in the cabin, the patent lay flat and heavy. On the table beside it, the letter from St. Louis waited under a smooth river stone. He reached into his pocket and took out the watch. He held it near his ear. The tick came steady as the slow melt of an icicle. He set it on a scrap of folded cloth and watched the tiny hand creep toward a mark no one else could see. He blew out the last candle. The loft went to a soft gray from the snowlight that comes when clouds sit close to the ground, and the night glows with its own faint fire. Under the window, beneath straw and a skin of frost, the small roots of lupine kept their quiet. The creek ran under ice with a steady talk. The valley breathed. The house did not fight it. The wind had learned a lullaby. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.